Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband News. So will BEAD be like Groundhog Day, at least the movie Groundhog Day, where we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again? There's one Missouri state representative that's afraid it might be that way. I'll be right back with more. Hey, thanks for joining me. Rick Husey here with Broadband News. So I want to take a look at this article. I thought it made some good points, and he agrees with me. So that's one reason I want to look at it as well. Is I think we're kind of in sync here on some of his comments on why monkeying with BEAD right now, as far as let's say the preference for fiber, would be a mistake. So see, this is here on Bent Institute for Broadband and Society. It's a op-ed by Missouri State Representative. His name's down at the bottom, and I'll get to that in a minute. But also, I wanted to make you aware that I did link to this, but I also linked to a video that I did last week on this topic, where I actually looked at the language in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, specifically the BEAD program, and what it talks about as far as priority broadband projects and reliable broadband service. I also looked at the low-cost broadband option that's required in there, and how they specifically state those things in the Act, because anything that's actually in the Act is law that's been passed by Congress, and the executive branch needs to deploy that or implement that. And that's what the NTIA was trying to do under the Biden administration. Now they threw in some additional stuff that was not in the bill that could be monkeyed with right now. So it's certainly possible that the Trump administration will want to take out some of those kind of onerous things that are in there about maybe environmental kinds of things that they need to do, and some workforce things, some those kinds of things that were more pet projects, let's say, of the Democratic Party. But there are specific things that are in the bill that are mentioned in there that you have to abide by. You can't just change those things out. And while it doesn't mention fiber specifically, it does, again, as I mentioned, it kind of defines what priority broadband projects are and what reliable broadband is. And those, if you look at that language, it certainly is pointing to fiber. I think you could easily make a case for that. It would be hard to make a case against that. So in addition to that, I look at the text of the bill, and I also look at videos of Ted Cruz and Howard Lutnick and Ariel Roth. Howard Lutnick's most likely going to be the new Commerce Secretary. I think he's got his, I don't know if it was today or it's coming up, where they're going to vote on him through the full Senate. Ariel Roth was named as the potential head of the NTIA. So everybody there, the three that I mentioned, sound like making noises like, oh, we want to roll out satellite because it's a lot cheaper. Hopefully when they look at the BEAD program, where it is, how far along we've come, and the fact that I think most states are going to want to do fiber everywhere they can, then they'll realize they don't want to change that. They might make it where it's a little easier for somebody to use an alternate technology, such as satellite or fixed wireless, but I think they're going to want to not mess with that too much. But again, this guy makes some good points. So there's a link to that video down below if you want to check that out. I think there's some good information in there. But I wanted to today look at this. So you see here, BEAD's Groundhog Day moment. So according to Albert Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Congress is taking this to a whole new level with its latest discussions about how to fix broadband internet deployment across the United States. He says, this is my 10th year as a broadband advocate. 7 of those years has been as state representative in Missouri's 5th House District. I was working on this issue as a grassroots advocate 3 years before being elected to office. Why? Because my corner of the state was blessed with being 8 of the 10 worst serviced counties in Missouri, or 10 worst served counties in Missouri. Why was that the case? Because with few exceptions, major league internet providers did not care whether we lived or died in Northeast Missouri. And of course, that's some hyperbole there. I don't think they thought that, but certainly large operators, the major operators, national operators, when they come into an area, they're going to look to serve those where they can make a quick return on investment, meaning that population density is a little higher there, and it's not so difficult to serve. There's no real challenges there, and that is a problem. That's why we're here where we are today. With rural areas not being able to get good broadband is because there's not a good economic case to deploy it. It's also more expensive to manage it, so you tend to have higher prices there in rural areas. But the big issue is getting it out there in the first place. He says here, the federal government, to its credit, decided to do something about it. Unfortunately, what they did was flat wrong. Instead of investing heavily in promising new technologies, it threw billions at the lowest cost alternative. Instead of methodically reviewing the areas where high-speed internet would need to go, they took the easy way out and declared through census block methodology that where one person out of 1,000 had high-speed internet, everyone did. They knew that was hogwash then, but kept on throwing good money after bad. Instead of evaluating bids thoroughly, they decided to apply the reverse auction process. So a couple of things here. One thing I have to say is that as we've been throwing money at broadband all these years, we were in a position way back when there weren't that many alternatives. You had cable modem service, you had DSL. Fiber broadband was something that was very new, very expensive. Just even splicing fiber, very expensive. So not just the materials, but the workforce to do it. So we were not in a position years ago, I think, to be able to roll out broadband or fiber broadband. So what they did was they rolled out what was considered the best technology at the time. So you looked at, again, you had some cable modem service, but a lot of DSL service, a lot of phone companies deploying DSL. And at the time, if you think about it, this was, we started out with dial-up internet, right? So we were talking about, speeds. If you had a 53K modem, you might get 50K, and that was awesome because there wasn't that much content on the internet, and things were pretty quick. You could download a web page. It would only take you 10 seconds for the page to load, or 20 seconds. Today it should be instant, right? But back then you'd wait 10 seconds, 20 seconds because that was fast, and there wasn't much on there. Weren't that many graphics, those kinds of things. So we progressed from there, and then suddenly, broadband was great, right? I mean, if you could get a meg down, like a T1 line, what was considered a T1 line back then, it's like, wow, if you can get that with DSL, that's amazing, because before we were getting 50K. And then, of course, 10 by 1, it's like 10 by 1 is awesome, 10 by 4, great. But these days, that's nothing, right? So back then, when we were deploying these slower speeds, that was basically was available. It was kind of the best thing that was available. And the technology was not set, DSL, for example, to be able to expand much faster than that. You could only get to a certain point with DSL and copper wires, and you've got distances as you get further away from the central office that can cause issues. So that's how we got into this, and funding the same things over and over again, I think, is that the technology wasn't quite there. But today, the technology is there. Fiber has gotten a lot less expensive to deploy. It's still not cheap, but any wired technology is going to be more expensive than a wireless or a satellite technology. But it's now on par with other wired technologies if you're going to put fiber in. So that's where we are today. So now that we're there today, we can actually deploy something that is future-proof, something that even today, you can get 25 gig symmetrical service if you wanted it today. You're not going to want to pay for it today, but you can get it in some places. In other places, you can easily get 10 gig symmetrical if they wanted to offer that to you, and if you wanted to pay for it, because XGS-PON is being deployed now. There's, again, some 25 gig PON that's out there. 50 gig or 100 gig is out there in the future, all over the same fiber that would be in the ground or in aerial deployments. You don't have to change out the base infrastructure, right? It's fiber and it works. So that's what we are today. So do we want to make a mistake and try to do something cheap now when we actually have reasonably priced, let's say, wired internet or fiber that we can do? So that's one reason I think that we've made the mistake a couple of times is we didn't have the technology. But do we want to do that again? And the census block methodology, that's what he's talking about there, is the old maps that we had at the time. All they said was that if an internet service provider served one customer in a census block, that's what they reported, and then it was assumed that everybody in that census block was served. So we really had no idea who had internet and who did not. We just knew that census block had at least one person in it. I don't think you'd have 1,000 people in a census block, but you had one person in that census block that was served, and then every other location in that census block was assumed served. So it would show up on the map as served, and we know that's not true either. The net result of these efforts. Oh, and then he talks about the reverse auction process. That's the RDOF. Well, first it was a CAF2 broadband offering, and then it was RDOF, and the speeds even between CAF2 and RDOF went up because again, the needs for broadband went up between those two programs, and they were both reverse auctions. And the way they worked was service provider would say, it was like name that tune. Okay, it was like, okay, I will build broadband there for $1,000 a location. Oh, I'll do it for $900 a location, and et cetera, whatever. And as these auction rounds went on, people would keep bidding until you got to a round where you had the lowest bidder. So again, you were kind of incentivizing people to maybe lowball some bids and to really stretch it so that they could win that bid, and that was a problem. So it says here the net result of these efforts across the United States, an unholy mess that guaranteed that the people who most desperately needed high-speed internet in rural and urban America were not going to get it. Billions of dollars worth of bids were so low that it was physically impossible to deploy even agonizingly slow fixed wireless internet in the areas that they won. Fly-by-night and downright mercenary internet outfits bid so low to pump up market share that responsible providers refused to even bid. So, and a big thing that happened was the inflation that took place after the RDOF auctions were complete, and a lot of these companies bid, and they were probably bidding based on what was a unusually long period of time with very low inflation. And then suddenly that completely changed after the pandemic and everything. We had supply chain shortages, and then we had other things. Lots of money put into the government to try to bring things back. And whenever you spend money like that, inflation goes up. So suddenly, these people that had done these lowball bids were looking at what they had bid and what it was going to cost them to put it in. A lot of people dropped out. Some of them dropped out earlier. Some of them dropped out later at the very last minute. So that is what he's referring to there. That was not a good place to be. And he says, and then something truly horrific happened, a global pandemic. Of course, I mentioned the inflation there, but he talks about here how that's kind of the trigger for, you had RDOF, you had CAF2, Connect America Fund, and then you had RDOF, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And they were moving forward, and then suddenly you had COVID hit. So then we had a couple of programs for that to be able to provide stimulus to the economy and broadband, infrastructure kinds of things, broadband being a big part of that. And he talks about here how COVID was an impetus to realize how bad the situation was for broadband. And again, it was bad because not so much because people didn't have broadband at some point, because they did. At some point, again, they were being served by DSL or other services that at the time were good, but it didn't take long for them to become obsolete. So suddenly they were trying to do things on the internet that they hadn't tried to do before. They might not have even had home internet. Maybe they were using internet at work, and suddenly they realized, wow, we've got to be working from home. We can't. We've got to do school from home. We can't. Or we were at home, and we've got this 10x1 DSL product that seemed so good a couple of years ago, and now we can't do Zoom calls, and the kids can't do their homework, those kinds of things. So we realized at that point that we'd got behind again in broadband, and we did not have the technology to kind of keep up with what was needed. So he talks about that. Certainly no one saw a pandemic coming. Says the federal government swung into action, first with the CARES Act, which was put together in a hurry and was a mess, and then the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, which showed that the federal government could actually get it right when it listened to everyone who complained at the top of their lungs about CARES. What was at the top of everyone's list? Broadband internet. ARPA was federalism at its best. So again, this guy's a Republican state House representative. So he's going to believe more in federalism, meaning that the federal government should actually do as little as possible and should send a lot of what it does to the states. So that's what he's saying here. The federal government left the heavy lifting of broadband implementation to the individual states, sending huge sums of money to the states along with lines of block grants. Where CARES had come down like a sledgehammer, ARPA landed like a feather. States swung into action, standing up broadband offices and funds where none existed weeks earlier. In Missouri, we are now well over $2.2 billion into broadband deployment funding. When we began in 2020, we were at zero. So, with ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, you had two funds. You had the Capital Projects Fund, which was $10 billion, I believe, and that was really meant for generally broadband projects, if I recall. That's primarily all that money was being used for. Then you had the state and local fiscal recovery fund, something like that, which is, I think, $350 billion, but that was used for things other than broadband. But a lot of states, including my state, Georgia, took most of that money and used it for broadband because, again, that was at the top of everyone's list after COVID, realizing, okay, if we have any shovel-ready jobs that are needed right now, it's going to be broadband. So a lot of states use their ARPA funding for broadband, and they've already deployed a lot of broadband in the states using ARPA. And every mile, every location that's covered with broadband for ARPA is one that does not need to be covered by BEAD. And most of the states that are doing that are using fiber. The companies that win those grants are generally using fiber if they're doing that. So, and we've still got RDOF out there, and there's some of that deployment going on as well. So let's see, we crafted a broadband grant process that was fair, transparent, and comprehensive in 2020 and again in 2022. We passed common sense guardrail language to make sure that our broadband funds would reach the people it was supposed to. We enacted stringent clawback and snap site inspection language to make sure that broadband providers using taxpayer dollars stayed on time, on task. COVID sharpened our focus, prompted us to act immediately while ensuring responsibility, and the federal government stayed out of our way. So again, the point he's making here is they could take that money and manage it better than, let's say, the huge federal government trying to do it for all 50 states. So far, so good. And then the feds decided to make a once-in-a-lifetime investment in America, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, a $42.5 billion program designed to close the digital divide once and for all. So again, that was the point of BEAD, was let's not do this again. Okay, we keep funding broadband. We've funded it with all those other programs before, including CAF2, RDOF. There was BTOP. There was CARES and ARPA. So a lot of money had been thrown at it already. Some of the money that was thrown at it later was being put forward for fiber and those kinds of projects. So some of that was having a good impact on getting us to where we don't need to do anything ever again, hopefully. But BEAD was meant to then fill in everything else so that everybody in the United States and the territories, because they're included as well, would be able to get broadband, right? So broadband, will everybody get fiber with BEAD? No, but really the majority of people with BEAD can get fiber. There's still going to be some really hard to reach, very expensive areas that will be left out, and that those can be, if we ever have to go back to the well, we're going to have to go back for those final little places there. But hopefully we want to minimize that, right? We want to minimize the number of places that don't get fiber today. So he says the most vociferous criticisms of BEAD have centered on how long it's taken to deploy. On its face, that is a fair criticism. And, a lot of that's political, right? We just had an election. So that was a big political football where it's like, you know what? This has been 4 years now. It's $42 billion, and not a single home has been connected with broadband. It's kind of the same thing as we spent all this money on electrical charging stations, 8 billion or whatever it was, and I think 8 have been built. So those were political footballs. And certainly on the environmental side, that's very political because only one side of the aisle really wanted to be focusing on that. Whereas for broadband, both sides of the aisle really do want their constituents to have more broadband. So he says, it's a fair criticism. Contextualized, though, however, the criticism does not hold water. No one is asking why it took so long. The simple answer, maps. And that is a big part of it. I've mentioned this before. So a big part of why the BEAD process took so long was because in the Act, and this was smart, in the Act it says before you go ahead and spend this money, you need to know exactly who has broadband and who doesn't, which locations can get it today and which locations can't. And we did not have that. We had the old stupid map that was by census block group, so you didn't know who had broadband. So that was a whole big process that had to take place before any of this money could go out the door. And it did take a little bit longer because there were 2 companies, I think, that were vying for what's called the broadband fabric, and that is kind of the underlying database of every single location in the United States and whether it should have broadband. And that's really quite an undertaking, by the way, by anybody, would be to try to identify every single roof structure in the United States and should that have broadband. In some cases, it's easy, right? If you go to a neighborhood and you can see all the houses in that neighborhood, it's like, okay, there's a house, there's a house, there's a house. As you get out in more rural areas, you got, okay, there's a house. What are these 4 structures? Is that a extra garage? Is that a chicken coop? Is that a cow pen? What is that? So, that was a process that had to happen. Is you have to identify every single location and every single basically structure that's supposed to have broadband, and then you need to determine, does it already have broadband or not? So There were two companies that were vying for that broadband fabric. One of them won the contract with the FCC, and the other one sued, and then they had to go through that process of getting through that lawsuit or getting that settled. And then CostQuest wound up winning that, and then CostQuest had to develop the fabric, had to put out a first map, had to put out the first fabric, and then the broadband operators had to make their first input into that fabric with the broadband data collection process. They had to state, okay, they had to put down everywhere that they could provide service, the maximum advertised speed they could provide, the latency is a latency under 100 milliseconds round trip. So all that had to take place, had to figure out, okay, several iterations of the map to figure out, is it right? Do we have all locations on the map? Do we have some locations that are not supposed to be on the map? Did all the broadband operators get all of their locations input, because that was new for them, and they had to match up FCC location IDs with their addresses. It was a long process. So he's definitely right. The map was a big part of what was making that delay. The other part is that, again, there were Democratic pet projects in there that were lengthening the amount of time that it would take for the states to put together their broadband plans, because they had to take into account all of these extra things, again, that were not in the original act, the Infrastructure Act. And then you've got subgrantees that need to look at that and decide, can we do this? Do we want to do this? This is really going to be expensive. Will we try to go jump through all these hoops? So that was another thing that was in there that could be causing delays and be causing maybe subgrantees, some service providers not to want to do the BEAD program. So that was a problem, and that would delay things as well. It says the FCC released a series of maps over the years that were deficient at best. They depended on providers to fill in the gaps, were clunky to use, and because they used census block methodology, were woefully inaccurate. So he's talking about the original FCC maps there. So I kind of brought you up to speed on the new FCC broadband map, which is much, much better than the old FCC maps, and has gotten more and more accurate with each iteration as people have realized, these are not good locations. There were broadband operators that originally forgot to do their data collection and put their broadband serviceable locations in. That a lot of that's been rectified now. So we've got pretty good maps now. He says here it gets worse. The latest brainstorm in Congress is to start capping how much funding can be allocated to a particular site. And I'm not sure what he's talking about there. That may be something they're talking about in Congress, because again, one of the talking points you've heard as the Trump administration has come in is, should we be spending $100,000 to hook up a single home? And you know what? I mean, money like that has been spent on some of these previous, like let's say through ARPA funding, as states were trying to reach their absolutely hardest locations with fiber. You can look and you can see that there were some locations that were incredibly expensive to reach. So maybe it's good that maybe that ARPA funding has been spent on that and won't have to be used for BEAD. But so that there is a question as to whether that makes sense. And if the states have only got a certain amount of money for BEAD and they've got a few options, and the best option for them is to maximize the amount of fiber that they can do and still have money over to reach every single other location with some other alternative technology. Have the most fiber you can and then reach everybody else with an alternative technology. But I think the concern is that the Trump administration is going to come in and say, you know what, you can't spend any more than, let's say, $5,000 per location, or even $1,200 per location. I did a video about that a few weeks ago where there were a couple of guys that were recommending, and these guys were young, like almost right out of college, that were saying, hey, we shouldn't spend more than $1,200 on a location, which is ridiculous. You can barely put anything in for $1,200. So I think that might be the concern, is that there's maybe some talk of doing that. But the other concern is that, as I mentioned, you can watch the videos yourself. Just click on that link that I did the broadcast last week, where you can hear Ariel Roth and Howard Lutnick specifically say, it's like they're saying, we want to do this the cheapest way possible. We want to make sure that there's not an extreme bias against other technologies. And both of those are statements that are a little bit concerning. I can understand why. It says here, this is a backhanded and rather clumsy way of trashing fiber, the consensus choice for best delivery of high-speed internet, and giving the inside track to satellite technology. And it does almost sound like that because, again, some comments have been made like, hey, we could cover everybody with satellite, and it's good. And it is good if you've not had anything better. And if you're on dial-up now, or if you're on slow DSL and you get satellite, you're thrilled. But you'd rather have fiber. And, how long will satellite serve you into the future? And that is the big question. He says, I have really bad news for Congress. No reputable provider with more than one brain cell to rub together is going to propose serving areas that do not make sense with fiber. That's probably true, unless somebody pays them a ton of money to do it. So if somebody's going to pay them $100,000 to connect up a home, they might do it. So it's not so much the provider on the provider side. It says no state broadband office populated by intelligent life is going to sign off on fiber proposals that do not make sense. And again, if the state has the money and it costs $100,000 to connect up a home, and they've got the money to do it fiber, they're probably going to do it. There's a reason, and that's when I say that, I mean if they can connect everybody up with fiber, because actually, if they can't, there's going to be certain extremely high cost threshold that they're supposed to identify under BEAD. But there are some states that believe they can reach everybody with fiber. I believe, unless the recent inflation has changed that. Not just a couple of years ago, it's like, oh yeah, we think we can get fiber to everybody. So we have to see there. But it says there's a reason for that. We are states, and we are a lot closer to the problem we are solving than the hidebound, learn nothing, forget nothing bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., who are bound and determined to turn BEAD into a nationwide production of Groundhog Day. So again, speaking of the movie Groundhog Day, is what he's saying there, is that, it's another day and we're doing the same thing, same exact thing. Even worse is the fact that with the dawn of artificial intelligence, what we're now calling the need for speed is more acute than ever. We've already seen a geometric progression in speed over the last decade. Remember when 10 by 1 was all the rage? Yeah, I do. I remember when that was really fast. I remember when our company started as a dial-up internet provider, and I remember, like I said, 50K was really fast. I remember somebody called me on the phone one day telling me about DSL, and I had not heard of it. And I said, well, what is that? He said, yeah, I'm wondering if you guys could provide it because, it's like the same speed as a T1. And at the time I was thinking, a T1, that's what we have. I think we had a T1. That was what we had for everybody. And that's 1.54 megabits per second symmetrical service, right? And I was thinking, there's no way that you're going to give a home user a T1 worth of service, but it wasn't just a couple of years later that was what was going on. And then it got up to 10 by 1 and even faster with some kinds of DSL, and again, a certain distance from the central office. So yeah, I remember those days. It says, my providers are telling me that 100 by 100, now the preferred but not mandated federal minimum speed, will be obsolete in the next 3 to 5 years. We'll zoom past 500 symmetrical to a gig in the process. Yeah, and now, if there's a fiber provider in your area, they're probably offering gig service as their top plan. Some of them will offer, for marketing purposes, if they've got a competitor, they might offer, 2.5 gig symmetrical, or maybe even 5 gig symmetrical. But 1 gig right now, that's kind of the high-end plan if somebody's got fiber service. So that's achievable today with fiber. You can't do that with satellite. You can't do that with fixed wireless. Again, you can get 5, 10, even 25 gig today over fiber. And would you ever be able to do that with satellite or fixed wireless? I don't think so. So again, are we setting ourselves up if we don't do fiber to be, as he's saying here, as we get just a few years down the road, are we setting ourselves up if we give everybody satellite or more people satellite than we need to, then having to go back and fund this again? It says, something else that's escaped the notice of our corner-cutting satellite enamored federal bureaucrats and alleged policymakers is that, 1, what goes up must come down, and 2, China is launching military satellites almost as fast as it is constructing coal-fired power plants. So first off, what goes up must come down. And the satellites, the original life of a satellite was estimated to be about 5 years. So as Elon Musk and maybe Amazon Kuiper start launching, Musk has already got 3,000 or more satellites up there in his constellation, and Amazon is planning on doing that. I think they've only had 2 prototypes launched so far at this point. But those satellites, after about 5 years, need to be deorbited without hitting anything, hopefully, either in space or on the Earth. And you have to replace every one that comes down. You got to replace. So after 5 years, you're going to be launching lots of satellites to replace those, in addition to maybe trying to grow your constellation further than that. So that is a risk. And then he talks about what China could possibly do with killer satellites. And I saw the headline. I didn't read the story. I should have. There was a headline the other day about how China has really gotten ahead of us in space and what they could do against our satellites, which surprised me because we had the Space Force launched like 4 years ago. So I guess after Trump left, maybe nothing was done with that, or maybe we're not telling people what we're doing with that. But space is an area we need to be paying attention to. So he's saying here, what could they possibly do with killer satellites? How about shoot down our extraterrestrial communications capability to both blind us and render our communication mute if we respond militarily when they decide to invade Taiwan? I seriously doubt that the Chinese have developed lasers that can take out bundled fiber cables anywhere in the United States, but have no doubt that can send us back to the Stone Age by annihilating our GPS-based economy. So might be a little bit, a little hyperbole there, but that is a risk for us, and it's just a risk in general. As you've got, again, satellites up there, you've got to replace them. What happens if there's not, if the return on investment on those satellites suddenly is not that good, and then does Elon Musk keep maintaining that over time? Or what happens if you've got just something happens in space where some of these satellites are hit, and then you've got this chain reaction of junk in space that you're trying to navigate all your other satellites around. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong up there. Another point to ponder with regard to speed, satellites can only do as much as existing and emerging technologies let them. Fixed wireless has experienced significant difficulties delivering higher speeds since those assets were first deployed. Satellites are similarly situated despite their recent improvements, and things have improved. The satellites today that are low Earth orbit are much better than the geosynchronous ones as far as speeds and especially latency. Fixed wireless is much better these days with 5G, but it's only going to get so much faster on these technologies. They're going to get a little bit better, but they're not anywhere near where fiber is today, and fiber is already light years ahead of that and can easily expand, as I mentioned, up to 100 gig probably over the same medium with not much difference in the technology. So he makes a good point there. Fiber, on the other hand, is future-proof. Dig once, bury it, and forget about it for 50 years because it uses glass as its conductor. It can deliver unlimited speeds and can be upgraded on a sustainable basis for decades. It can't deliver unlimited speeds, but it can, as I mentioned, it can deliver a lot faster speeds than these others, and it can be upgraded where you don't need to be changing out, you don't need to rip out the fiber to do that. You get what you pay for. Now is not the time to short-circuit BEAD. Now is not the time to deploy broadband internet on the cheap. We've been there, we've done that, and that is precisely what landed us in this mess to begin with. Just the caveat there that we did not have the fiber technology for years to be able to deploy it, at least not anywhere near where we could afford it, right? So we're not in that situation today. We're in that situation today where we can deploy fiber to most everyone. There are going to be some areas where it's not really possible, but that's the big difference, I think. So federal folks, please do us a favor. Stop trying to fix things. You've done more than enough harm already. Actually embrace the federalism you claim to love. So he's talking there about the Republicans, because it is the Republicans that are making all the noise about the fiber preference and feeling like there's not enough emphasis on these alternative technologies. The states have solved the problems you created. Admit it and get on with your lives. As Ronald Reagan so famously said, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. The key to good advice is taking it. Leave us alone. Leave BEAD alone. And for once, get out of the way and stay out of the way. Groundhog Day is best viewed on a screen, not lived by those who still do not have broadband internet. So again, this is Louis Riggs, a state representative in the Missouri House of Representatives from Hannibal, Missouri. He's been in the state house 7 years. And as he mentioned, he's been kind of an advocate for broadband much longer than that. So he knows what he's talking about for the most part. As I read through this, he's been through it. He knows the problems. And this is the kind of person, at the state level that you want managing broadband managing funds going to broadband deployment, because he knows his area. The broadband offices in the states know their states. Especially with BEAD, they've traveled the states. They've talked to all the different communities in the states. They know what's needed. They've all been involved in the mapping process. So the states are in a position now to be able to deliver on BEAD. We've had a long delay. As he mentioned, a lot of it was related to the maps. There are other issues related to maybe some of the rules and regulations in there that shouldn't be in there. But we're now at a point where the states can start sending out money. Louisiana, they probably got their money now because I think they did get approved. A couple of states, 3 states have gotten their final proposals approved. That was Louisiana, Nevada, and Delaware, I believe. So they may have gotten their money at this point. I can't remember if they got it right away. I think so. I think the final proposal, I think that's when they get their money. And all of the states, the rest of the states have gotten 10% of the funds because they got their Volume 2 proposals in. And once that was done, they got 10% of the funding that they're supposed to get. So they're making use of that through the application process now. So a lot of states are finishing up challenges or done with their challenges and getting application processes going where their subgrantees are starting to apply to be able to get the funds. So this train is well down the track, and what we don't want to do right now is derail anything that would make things take a lot longer. And for this administration, they are not going to want to do that either, because this is a Republican state senator, and I know there are Republican congressmen in the House of Representatives and the Senate that want this money as soon as possible to be able to get their constituents connected up. So for them, even though the bipartisan infrastructure law was only somewhat bipartisan, I think all of the Republicans, everybody wants this money to be able to go to their constituents so they can get broadband. That's different from, let's say, the environmental provisions in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or in the what was erroneously called the Inflation Reduction Act, which had nothing to do with inflation. It was an environmental bill. So all of that stuff was not something that Republicans would want or were pushing. So this is something that they want. So they can put pressure on the Trump administration to do what's right, which would be to, again, maximize fiber. And if the Trump administration wants to come out and say, you know what, we're going to relax the need or the fiber preference where you can use alternate technologies if you want to in other situations, and then leave it up to the states if they want to do that. And most of the states are going to want to use fiber. They're not going to want to have to do this again either. So if they can put fiber somewhere, they're going to put fiber somewhere. But don't tell the states, don't put a maximum on the amount per location, for example, and say anything above that, you've got to use an alternate technology. Don't do that. Let them make the decision. They're the ones that know best. And again, if you do that and you give a lot more people satellite or fixed wireless than you would have otherwise, then we're going to be coming back later and having to connect up more people. We're still going to have some folks that don't get fiber through this. It's just the case. There's just a limited amount of funds, and you got somebody on the top of a mountain. They may have to deal with satellite. You might have a town somewhere in Alaska where they might have to deal with satellite versus, let's say, fiber, because they're just so remote. But for the vast majority of people, we need to get them hooked up with fiber now. That's what this whole project was about. This whole program was about. Let's do what we can now. Appreciate you joining me today. If you found this interesting, if you give me a like on the video, appreciate it. Click the subscribe button, ring the bell to be notified when I'm live, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.